Hi guys, my name is Maddie, and for my data management statistics project, I looked at the relationship between the amount of goals scored in a player's career versus the amount of games they played. And specifically, I looked at the stats in the English Premier League, or also known as the EPL. So for just a little background information on the EPL, it is the most watched sports league in the world, and it is extremely competitive, so only the top 20 clubs in England get to participate each season. So how the Premier League works is that the season takes place from August till May, and these top 20 teams will participate, and depending on how many goals they score during each game, it will give them either a win, a draw, or a loss. So 3 points gives you a win, 1 point is a draw, and then no points if you lose the game. And the team with the most amount of points at the end of the season will take home the title. So the reason I chose this topic to explore for my project was because soccer's been my favorite sport since I can remember, and some of the most influential and adored players in my life has at some point played for the English Premier League. So I thought it would be interesting to see if any of my favorite players would show up on either one of these two lists here. So my independent variable for this data set was the amount of appearances a player made, which would greatly affect the dependent variable, which is the amount of goals a player scored. So my hypothesis was that there would be a very strong correlation between the amount of appearances a player made versus the amount of goals they scored. And so I figured that the more appearances a player made throughout his career would equal more goals, and vice versa. A lesser amount of appearances would equal to a lesser amount of goals scored. Although from previous knowledge of certain players in the past, I do know that there are some unique players that could break this mold and that have definitely had a lot more goals scored in a lesser amount of appearances, which I knew would lead to some outliers in my data. So I actually had another hypothesis that I wanted to take a look at that didn't relate at all to the independent or dependent variables I chose, but it was just something interesting that I thought was worth noting. So I also wanted to take a look at the nationality of the players that ranked on these lists and see whether their nationality would have them higher on the list or lower, depending on how many goals or appearances they made. So my hypothesis was that English players were more likely to be higher up on these lists than players of other nationalities. From my previous knowledge of knowing how the Premier League system works, a lot of the players that enter the Premier League when they're young come from the youth programs, which are based in England and are available to English players. And so I figured that English players would be more likely to be higher on these lists than other nationalities, since a lot of them have gone through youth programs that have now led them to the Premier League. So the data collected from this project was all received from the premierleague.com under the Stats Center. So first I took a look at the goals, and you can view the full list. So I looked at all the nationalities and all the stats of all the players here. And then I also took a look at the appearances section. And I was going to compile this myself, but I did find Wikipedia had an article which had already compiled this together, so I used that for my stats. So I took the data from the Wikipedia page and from the two sections on the Premier League website, and this is how I cleaned it up for my data set. I titled it Goals Scored Compared to Games Played in the English Premier League. So over here I have the goals, and over here I have the appearances, and then I made a column for the nationality of the player as well. Alright, so first I just wanted to take a look at the goals scored in EPL histogram, which shows an interesting trend to me. So the graph starts off pretty normal. It makes sense that the most amount of players would have scored a lesser amount of goals, because obviously not every player can score an insane amount of goals in their career. And it does decrease as expected. The thing that I found really interesting, though, is that how no players scored between 220 goals and 260 goals, which was interesting to me, as I would have thought at least a couple more players would have scored that many goals. And it just makes the jump from 220 to the one player who scored 260 goals to just be very interesting, and it's definitely an outlier there. As we can see, the most amount of goals scored was 260, and then it drops all the way down to 208 goals scored, which is just very interesting that there was no other player who could achieve any amount of goals in between those two. So looking at the games played in EPL histogram, it's a little more expected and less surprising than the goals scored in EPL histogram. But I do find that there are still a couple interesting points to be noted. So first off, I found it very interesting that the second lowest frequency in the bins was the first one with the shortest career. So only 4 players had a career between 150 to 250 games played, which is really impressive considering they did score over 100 league goals in that career. I figured that they may have had short careers due to leaving the leagues eventually due to their talent, so they would have had less games played. The other one, the lowest frequency, isn't as surprising to me as there are few players that can have extremely long careers due to many different factors such as injuries, shortening their careers, or also, as I said before, them switching leagues. The games played box and whisker plot is very unsurprising to me, and it makes complete sense as the average career would be about 400 appearances, which makes sense considering the amount of goals that they scored. But the goals scored in the EPL box and whisker plot is a bit more interesting, how it just shows how hard it is to score over 200 goals in your career, as the median, the first and third quartile are very leaning towards the bottom half of the data rather than the top. So looking over at the measures of central tendency and spread, specifically for the section games played, we can see that there actually is no mode for this data set, which did confuse me at first, as I figured there'd at least be a little bit of an overlap between any amount of games that 2 players played, at least 2 players. But then it did get me thinking that every player does have their own specific career path that they take. None will be identical to another player, so it's almost impossible that 2 players, let alone more, would have the same amount of appearances that they made in their Premier League career. So moving on to our 2 variable graph, let's take a look at our scatter plot. When I first put in the data for the scatter plot, I really did think that it would prove my hypothesis to be correct. Although it really actually does the opposite, as I figured my data would be actually a lot more closely knit together and less spread apart like it is in reality. So looking at this player over here, we can see that he scored 260 goals, which is more than any other player, and it actually does fit pretty nicely in line with our line of best fit. Although when we do look at a couple other points in this graph, we can see there are some outliers that do really affect this data set. So for example, as we can see, this player here and this player here have each scored a little under 150 goals, but their appearances range from a little over 200 to a little over 400 games played, which is quite a big gap if you think about they are playing a soccer game. So 200 and 400 is really 2 hugely different numbers. So looking at our statistics here, our R value is 0.2561, and since this is a positive graph, we know that 0.1 to 0.3, being the value of R, correlates to a weak strength of relationship. Also, we can see that our R squared value is 0.0656, which is extremely weak, as we can see by the coefficient of determination, which states that the closer it is to 1, the stronger the correlation between the 2 variables is. Alright, so in conclusion, the data analysis actually proved my hypothesis to be very incorrect. As I initially stated, I believed that the amount of appearances, as they increased, the amount of goals would also increase. But it actually proved to be a little more random than that, and the 2 actually didn't correlate much. Although I do feel it's worth noting that just because these points are a little more random and less close-knit than I initially thought. We also have to take into consideration that these are all spectacular players who have natural talent that is hard to account for just by looking at a graph. So the last thing that I thought was pretty interesting was going back to the nationality of the players. So I did find that 18 out of 28 of the players that I looked at were from England, which that part of my hypothesis was correct. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope that you learned a little something about the English Premier League.